We interrupt this record to bring you a special bulletin. The reports of a flying saucer hovering over the city have been confirmed.
Did you really go out with an alien? Uh-huh. What was it like? Real different.
Becoming Human, a Mork and Mindy podcast. Hey everybody, this is Paula Scheffner with episode 9, A Mommy for Morky. This first aired on November 16th, 1978. The IMDb synopsis is Mindy reconnects with an ex-boyfriend who's intent on marriage. Meanwhile, Mork uses his age machine to revert to childhood. This was directed by Howard Storm, his fourth of 59 Mork and Mindy gigs. This was written by Tom Tenowich, who was one of the executive story editors, but it's the first episode on which he has a specific script credit. The episode begins at the apartment, and we see Mindy sitting on the couch with a man. He is played by Barry Van Dyke, who was the 27-year-old son of Dick Van Dyke, and his character is named Dan Phillips. In this scene and his later scenes, he dresses in a mix of 70s formal and casual, like he'll wear a suit jacket but no vest or tie. Mindy, as she was when she had a date on Mork Runs Away, is dressed in a long, soft-looking floral dress. He says that he likes her place, implying that he hasn't been there before, or maybe not very often, or maybe he's just making small talk. He says he wasn't sure if she'd ever want to see him again. She calls him Dan, and somewhat sarcastically asks if she looks like the type of girl who would hold a little thing like a broken engagement against him. And then she jokes that he has the right to remain silent. This is the first time that we are told that Mindy has actually been engaged before. And we don't really get any other information about it. We don't know when it happened, how long it lasted, why they broke up, or anything like that. It's just very sketchy. He's pretty much a MacGuffin of a character, and we haven't yet really seen Mindy with any kind of boyfriend who is actual competition for Mork. And he's mostly, as we'll see, just there to throw the Mork and Mindy relationship in another light. Although it does get very complicated here. Dan says that he never meant to hurt her. He just wasn't ready to settle down. She wonders why then he asked her to marry him, and he says he was young and he didn't know what he wanted. I'm not sure how old he's supposed to be now. I mean, Mindy is only 21. He doesn't look like he's even 30, but maybe he means young in comparison to where he is now. Like maybe they were engaged at 18 or something. She admits that she was surprised that he called, and she figured he was out sowing his wild oats. He says that now he's more interested in rice, as in throwing rice at a wedding, although he uses this as a segue to an invitation to a Japanese restaurant for lunch tomorrow. She says that she'd love that. He gets up and kisses her forehead and says he'll pick her up at noon. At the door, he says that it was fun, and she says that it always was, implying that they always had fun together. And they kiss goodnight. Immediately after he leaves, Mork swings in on a rope down from the attic. He asks Mindy about her mating, and she corrects this to dating, which I think they had a similar confusion on an earlier episode. Mindy says it was wonderful. Dan took her to a Great Danish restaurant, so Mork of course asks what Great Danes eat. When he hears about the Japanese restaurant, he asks, "What is it about this earthling that makes you so hungry?" Mindy says that they're old friends, and the relationship once got serious. So hearing the word serious, he thinks that he has to cheer her up, so he takes her to see his attic apartment, which he's now had time to redecorate. He says that it's Scamp City and totally taste-free. So then we get our first real glimpse of the attic as Mork's apartment, like a sublet. Going from stage right to stage left, some of the significant furniture and decorations. There's a couch, a coffee table, grass growing on the walls, an upside-down Star Wars poster, which I think might be a little joke because The idea for Mork came from Scotty Marshall being a Star Wars fan. There's a lamp jutting out sideways from the wall, which is so he can read in bed. And in fact, his bed is a red and white circus swing. He says that sleeping on it isn't bad once you get the hang of it. He also has a rope that is a hide-a-bed for house guests. There's also a dressmaker's dummy, and we see Moo Moo the moose again for the first time in a while, and there's also a trunk. He brings out a footstool that's shaped like a foot, and she's very amused by this, and he says that he's ordered end tables, so you can guess what that looks like. She thinks that the apartment is very him, and he's done a fabulous job of decorating it. She sits down on the coffee table and accidentally hits a little device that looks like a calculator. It's an Orkin age machine, which is a small computer. And remember, this is small computer by 1978 standards. A small computer that changes Orkin brainwaves so that they can go to any age they want. They do this as a way to relax and escape tension. It's a sort of vacation, like Fantasy Island. So he gets on his knees and does a Hervé Villechaize impression, of course, which was one of the trendy impressions of that time. Mindy is surprised by this device and thinks he's kidding, and he says no kidding would be button number 3. So she tries it, and that's a little bit of foreshadowing because he will be in a 3-year-old mind state for much of the episode later on.
No, I don't want your cooties!
Wow, come on. All the other kids are in hyperspace. I just want the keys to the egg and be really right on. Where's Dave?
Whoa, I didn't know it went that far back.
We go to the music store presumably the next day, but not necessarily. Fred is with a customer, so I'm very happy that business is slowly picking up. Mindy comes in with Dan and thanks him for lunch. He invites her to dinner, and she wonders how many restaurants they've been to in the last 3 weeks. So I don't know if the first scene was after they've been going out for 3 weeks, but I think actually it must have been their first date since the broken engagement. Now 3 weeks have passed. They went to the Japanese restaurant and various other restaurants in the meanwhile. Dan says that she saw through him. He's trying to get to her heart through her stomach. And she says she likes him because most guys try to take the scenic route, so using a couple cliches playing off of each other. Fred says hi to Dan, who says, "Hi, Mr. M." Either at the time that Mindy was engaged or maybe now, Dan has this nickname for Fred. It's a little bit like on Happy Days where people would say Mr. and Mrs. C for Cunningham. Dan says he'll pick Mindy up at 8 and they kiss goodbye. As he's leaving, a very pregnant young blonde woman comes in. She says she would turn sideways, but she doesn't have a sideways, and she laughs at her own joke. Throughout the scene, she's just in a really cheerful mood. No problems, really, with pregnancy other than some minor inconvenience. She is played by Susan Lawrence, and the character is Sally Friedman, and this is a role that she would return to later in the season. Susan Lawrence did some other ABC television during that decade, like Welcome Back, Kotter, and ABC After School Special. And so from what I very vaguely recall, I felt like I knew her when she came in, and she is treated like a character that not only Mindy, but her family is familiar with, although she has not yet met Mork. Sally and Mindy greet each other. Mindy asks how Sally's doing, and Sally says she feels like the post office because neither of them deliver on time. Cora calls her Sally dear and asks if they can help her in any way, said she might be a customer. Sally asks if they can tell her if her shoes match, which is near as I can tell they do. Cora then asks if Sally put in a request for a boy or a girl, which is a funny way of putting it. I believe that it wasn't until the 80s that people could actually know the sex of the baby before birth, although there was a lot of so-called old wives' tales and theories about how you could guess this. Fred asks what difference it makes. With a mother like Sally, the baby is going to be beautiful either way, which I thought was actually not just sweet, but kind of progressive for Fred. He surprised me with that. Sally thinks that this is lovely, and she promises to name the baby after him if it's a boy. So Cora reacts with, "Fascinating, a boy called Wiener," and then she exits. Fred goes after her, and they're going into the back room. Sally wants the little engine that could, presumably on a record, and that was something I think maybe last into the 80s definitely was a big thing, being a kid in the 70s and earlier, maybe back to the 50s, where you could get a story, usually on a full album-sized record. You could get really short stories on singles, which seems to be what happens on this episode. And a lot of times it would be the book and the record packaged together, which still happens some with CDs, but you did also have standalone story records. Even though this is a music store, they sell records, and maybe there was no place else in town, like a bookstore, that had that particular story. And it's an interesting choice because, of course, The Little Engine That Could is a story about optimism and perseverance. So that tells us something about Sally. Mindy starts browsing through the singles in a little box that says special, children's records 99 cents. So yet again, the music store is having a sale. Mindy thinks Sally looks absolutely radiant, and she's never looked so good. Sally says that it's motherhood, and she tells Mindy that she should try it sometime. Mindy says maybe. She likes kids, but she's not ready yet to be a mother. Mork comes in and asks Mindy who her fat friend is. Mindy scolds him by his name, so he thinks it's a parallel universe, and Sally is also named Mork. And so he offers her the nanu-nanu handshake, which we haven't seen in a while. Mindy introduces them and says that Sally is pregnant. Mork doesn't seem to be familiar with pregnancy. Sally is surprised that his parents never told him about it, and he says he didn't have parents. He's a test tube baby. So that's a different attitude. The idea was that the petri dish and the test tube were themselves parents with personalities. He, of course, had a broken home, and Mindy, as usual, has to play this off as Mork just being a joker. The baby kicks, so the two women have to explain that, and Mork is skeptical about a baby being in his stomach. He thinks that they're trying to jive his socks off. Sally is amused by this. I don't know if she just thinks Mork is just this weird friend of Mindy's, but she's cool with it. With her permission, Mork kneels and puts his head and his hands against her stomach. And then after he stands up again, he says that kids get in the darndest places. Sally says she can't wait till the baby's born so she can see him. So she's assuming it's a boy. Mork guesses that the baby will be round. Mindy asks if Sally will go back to work after she has her baby. We don't find out here, and I don't think on the other episode either, what Sally does for a living. I assume she's about Mindy's age, maybe a friend from high school, since there seem to be a lot of those around in town. Probably not much older than Mindy. Sally says that she wants to do all that hokey stuff. Blocks, playing peekaboo, going for walks in the park, watching her child grow up. And that will be her career. Mindy thinks this is really nice. I'll talk about this more later, but there's interesting dynamic going on here, as we see with other female characters in Gary Marshall's shows. This tension between old-fashioned values and modern values. Can they coincide? Do you have to choose? Mindy definitely respects Sally's choice, but it's not necessarily going to be her choice. Mindy gives Sally the Little Engine record on the house, saying it's a birthday present, as in a present for somebody about to be born. Sally leaves, and Mindy says she envies her because Sally knows what she wants. Mork envies her baby for having a mother, and Mindy gently puts her arm around Mork. So I talked about this on a previous episode, this longing, this wistful longing that Mork has for parents, and this episode goes right to that with some other things going on as well. We return to the living room, and Mork is in the kitchen wearing his red and white nightcap and nightshirt. Mindy and Dan come back, and they kiss goodnight in the doorway. Mork watches them, and he looks wistful in a different way, like he's being left out of something. And they don't notice him, and Dan leaves. Mindy is surprised that Mork is up so late. He says that something's bothering him. He's going to soak in a hot tub. There's a wash tub on that wicker chest in the center of the living room, and he soaks his head. She pulls him out and says that on Earth you soak your feet, but he says he wouldn't last 5 minutes that way. As usual, there's this body reversal thing going on with Mork, more than we've seen in a while actually, and there will be more of that in a later scene. They sit on the couch and he explains how he's starting to question his upbringing ever since he met Sally. He was raised by a computer, the Nanny Vac 30. The 8,000 kids in the warehouse called her Nanny for short.
Every gleam, she'd wash me, feed me, burp me, take care of all my needs.
Did she change you too?
But I'm a better person for having known her. But somehow after seeing Sally and how happy she was, I feel like I'm missing something.
Oh, Mork, you miss being loved.
But Nanny was always there. Every morning I'd roll past her on the conveyor belt. She'd pick me up in her warm little metal claws, tickle me under the chin with a high-intensity laser, and sing in that soft little voice. If that's not love, what is it?
Factory servicing.
Mindy says that an Earth mother does all those things because she wants to, not because she's plugged in. And Mindy can't think of a job that's more important than this.
Do you want to have babies someday?
Well, you know, I didn't think I did, but I think I might, yeah.
How about tomorrow?
Mork, it isn't that easy.
I'll help.
Mork, I think there's something that you and I should talk about.
Oh, if it's about having babies, I know about that. First, the bird lands and adds the pollen.
Mindy says Dan asked her to be his wife. Mork says, Dan, that guy you've been eating around with? The audience reacts a lot, like this is suggestive, which it is and it isn't, like much of this episode, actually. Mork is relieved that Mindy hasn't said yes, but she says she thinks she might. Mork says he's very happy for her, but he doesn't sound like it, and he soaks his head. Then it's a different day, and they're in different outfits. They are sitting on the couch in the attic. So already this is becoming another space that they can use in the apartment. He asks her what's on her brain. She says that she's about to be married, but she may be biting off more than she can chew. Mork says that sounds like marriage on Alpha Centauri. The bride and groom eat the best man. It's done in good taste, though. Mindy is worried that she doesn't know what it'd be like to have a child. Mork is sad because he doesn't know what it'd be like to have a mother. So then he gets his age machine and he sets it for 3 years old for 10 minutes. And he goes into his kid persona. And this was something that we would see a lot of on Mork and Mindy, and indeed throughout Robin Williams' career, particularly in stand-up. When he played a child, he truly became submerged in that character. And so there's this tension and contrast between this grown, hairy young man and this innocent, uninhibited child personality. Although in a sense, there is always a childlike aspect to Robin Williams. This is just in its purest form. He tries to get her to hold him and knocks her over. She says he's too heavy. He finds his belly button and wants to see hers. He refuses to hand over the age machine, and he does a raspberry and laughs.
Now, Morky, Dan is going to be here any minute, and it'll be embarrassing to have a giant 3-year-old running around, so give me your age machine. Can't get it, Weena. Now.
She calls Mork a young man and demands that he hand over the age machine, but he stuffs it down his pants. The doorbell rings. She says that Mommy has company, so Mork should take a nap. He says he's not sleepy and he wants to stay up all night and annoy Mommy Shazbot. She promises that if he'll take a nap, she'll make his favorite treat, which he knows is Bologna Sundae. So this is at least the second episode with Bologna Sundaes mentioned, and there are other episodes where bologna is very significant to Mork. He wants her pearl necklace, so she gives it to him on the promise that he will be quiet. She goes downstairs and grabs her coat, but Dan says the movie doesn't start for another hour, so she reluctantly comes back in. He gives her a teddy bear, which is for their firstborn. She says this is a little premature, especially because she hasn't said yes yet. And he says, "Oh, you will." Dan hears Mork making noises up in the attic, and Mindy says that it's squirrels. Dan says that he can hardly wait to hear the pitter-patter of little feet, and then Mork treads heavily. Mindy says there's a plumber in the attic, and then some of the pearls roll downstairs. Dan wonders if the plumber broke his necklace, and Mindy says that the plumber got the pearls out of the pipes, so she goes upstairs to see if he found her earrings. Mork pops out of a trunk with a red and white beanie on top. He laughs gleefully after he startles her. She scolds him, and he spits out another pearl and loudly insists that he's being quiet. Then he says he has nothing quiet to do and he's not a mime, which is, of course, a little joke because Robin Williams did have mime training. She really wants him to play quietly, so he says that he'll play dress up, but he continues to misbehave. Mindy gets frustrated and exclaims, "Kids!" Meanwhile, Dan has been picking up all the pearls. He says that the plumber doesn't sound too experienced, and Mindy says only the young ones will make house calls, which of course doesn't make any sense because it's not like a doctor where in the 60s and 70s there was starting to be the transition, particularly on television, from people getting house calls to going to a doctor's office, and obviously that's not going to work with a plumber. Dan tells Mindy that when they have kids, she can't leave her pearls lying around because they will put them in their mouths. And she says, "I've heard." Dan wants 10 kids, and she says this is inconceivable. And I'm not sure if that's meant to be a pun because it's not delivered as a joke and there's no audience reaction. Dan says kids are great, they're so much fun and a joy to have around. But of course, meanwhile, Mork is acting like a bratty little kid upstairs, and then he starts crying, and this puzzles Dan. So Mindy says that the plumber brought his kid because he couldn't find a babysitter. Mindy goes back upstairs again. She finds Mork crying on the floor. She goes to him and tries to comfort him. He says that Moo Moo bit him, and this is the first time that we've seen Moo Moo the moose in a while. It has Mork's beanie over its mouth. So Mindy scolds Moo Moo, and Morky says that Mommy was protecting him against bad Moo Moo. Mindy wants Mork to sit down so she can dry his tears, and he sits on his face for the first time in a while. She says she can't dry his tears if he's sitting on them. She blows his nose on a face towel.
No, everything's okay.
Will you always protect me and take care of me?
Well, I will until you're old enough to take care of yourself, which will be in about 1 minute.
Mindy says that Mommy will go downstairs if Morky is all right. He says he's a big boy and he puts on a fireman's helmet. She's about to go and then he says he's got to go potty, number 3. And I don't know if that's number 1 plus number 2 or if Orkin bathroom habits are different. She goes back downstairs and tells Dan that the plumber's okay now because she cheered up his kid. Dan jokes that she's a real plumber's helper, and then we get Child Mork making a variation on his humor catchphrase. Dan says that the child has a well-developed sense of humor, and Mindy says that he's old for his age. They leave the room, turning out the light. Mork comes downstairs and calls for Mommy. He sees the teddy bear and takes it, and then he hears a car leaving.
Goodbye, Mindy.
The next scene is later that night. Mindy and Dan this time do a handshake goodbye, and he leaves. Mork is upside down and sleeping on the couch, and the teddy is upside down too. Mindy turns off the TV and puts her coat over Mork, kind of like a blanket. This wakes up Mork, and she says that he must have fallen asleep while watching TV. He says if he was asleep, then the TV must have been watching him, which is sort of a 1984-ish line, in my opinion. He asks her about the movie, and she says they didn't go to the movie, they just talked. Well, mostly Dan talked, and she listened. She's not going to marry Dan. And while she's slowly telling Mork this, she hangs up her coat and gets milk out of the little refrigerator. Mork says bummer in reaction to her not getting married, although we know, of course, that he doesn't want her to. He says that she'll have to rent babies now. She says that Dan kept talking about babies instead of the two of them. He didn't want a wife as much as he wanted a family. She says that she wants to become a couple before she's a group, and this would become very ironic in season 4 with the speed of how quickly Mork and Mindy became parents after their wedding. Mork says that he's sorry that she lost her husband, and this line comes across differently than the misunderstanding when he didn't realize that Mrs. Wanker losing Mr. Wanker was not simply misplacement, but actual death.
Did my becoming a child affect your decision?
Well, I have to admit it opened my eyes. It's hard to be a mother.
Yeah, it's pretty tough being a kid, too. But you made it easy. You know something?
What?
You're gonna make a terrific mother.
Oh, no.
A toast.
To motherhood?
Maybe. To chickens with lips.
Then for the tag, we have Mork in his night clothes hanging from his bed swing as he summons Orson. Then when we see him inside his mind, he's standing and doing sort of a yo-yo trick without a yo-yo. So Mork does know how to do mime. And I just want to mention, this is at least the 3rd episode in a row where instead of that very formal posture that Mork did for the early reports, he's getting much more casual, slouching and napping and doing tricks. Orson asks what he learned about Earth this week, and Mork says that on Earth, babies aren't grown in test tubes, they're grown in something wonderful called a mother. Orson says this is the old-fashioned way, and 80 bleems ago they did it as part of a nostalgic craze. I've got to mention that I really don't think a bleem is 2,000 years anymore. That's what we were told on My Favorite Orkin when Mork was talking to Richie Cunningham. The math just doesn't work, particularly if Nannyvac was performing tasks only once a bleem. Unless their lifespans are just unfathomably long, it just doesn't add up. I think basically a bleem is as long as they want it to be for the convenience of that conversation. Mork says that sometimes he thinks the old ways are best. Orson disagrees, and he says nap, which I think we've had on another episode where nap means no. Orson believes the Orkin method of parenthood is much more efficient. As a baby, he was raised by Nannyvac 26, so presumably 4 Nannyvacs before the addition that Mork had, although maybe they were just in simultaneous warehouses, but I get the impression that Orson is older than Mork. Mork says that on Earth, mothers do all of those activities and more for their entire life. It's a warm and wonderful thing. He says that mothers are paid nothing, not because it's considered of no real value, but because motherhood is priceless. Mork wants Orson to tell him a bedtime story, and Orson admits that he doesn't know any. The sign-off is as usual, Mork calling him Your Immenseness again. But this is a more reflective, kind of wistful, kind of melancholy report compared to some others, because that is the headspace that Mork is in right now. So on the surface, this was a pretty straightforward episode with Mork and Mindy learning things about childhood and parenthood and family. But because of who they are and who they are to each other, it gets a little murky. When I was thinking about how I would rate this on the heart scale, which is 0 to 4 points, of how viable a romantic relationship do Mork and Mindy have on this episode, it's a very tricky, murky area. There is something Freudian going on here, although they're not related by blood or legally or anything like that. Mork and Mindy, by this point in the season, have already become something of a family to each other, although she has a close-knit relationship with both her father and her grandmother. She had said in a previous episode that her home wasn't really a home until Mork came along, so he is a different sort of family. Because of the nature of how Mork and Mindy met and the role that she plays as his guide on Earth and in the process of teaching him to become human, or at least appear human, there is a parent-child dynamic much of the time. She's teaching him and taking care of him and protecting him. So this, with its title and its plot, gets to the heart of that and then kind of skitters off into other territory as well, because there is also the aspect of there is an attraction between them. There is a tentative, not yet fully recognized romantic love as well. Mork is also learning about romance and mating and all that. So this episode blurs this. And I think that the scene of him at the window as he changes from a needy child to a longing man who has a somewhat unrequited love for her, although not yet the vocabulary to express that. It's a very complicated dynamic. I'm not sure how much of this was intentional, but it is there in Robin Williams' performance. Pam Dauber is basically playing it as her friend has regressed to childhood for the evening, and she's got to juggle this with the possibility of somebody that she used to love coming back into her life and offering her a chance at love, marriage, parenthood, the whole ball of wax. And yet, she's not sure she wants this. And it's not clear, maybe it's Dan. You know, he is putting a lot of pressure on her. After 3 weeks, he wants to marry her. He wants to have a very large family. Anytime in the 20th century, 10 kids is a lot. It's a big, big family. To plan that from the beginning is understandably intimidating. Mindy is interested in marriage and motherhood. That becomes clear through her interactions with Sally, and yet Mindy is not yet at that place in her life, and it's implied that if Mindy became a mom, she would want to be a stay-at-home mom and not work outside. This, of course, will become much more complicated when Mindy does have a baby because of how it happens. Mork being a father is not even under discussion yet. I also need to point out that we haven't heard anything lately about Mindy's college plans. Maybe they're waiting till the next fall? She does want to be a journalist, but she doesn't talk about it. For now, she's just working the music store. She seems to enjoy it. She likes working with her family, but it's not a career. I could certainly understand her feeling that motherhood is more important and not something that she would do simultaneously. So there's all that going on. There's not a lot of Fred and Cora here. You know, we get the obligatory bickering. They are pretty much off to the side. There's not really even a subplot for them. They show up, have a few lines, exit the room, and that's it. I do have to say, and no offense to Barry Van Dyke, but Dan is alternately bland and controlling somehow. He's handsome and, you know, but there's nothing really, we don't know what the attraction was then or is now. He's somewhat nice, they have fun together, but there's no specifics. We are definitely not going to root for the Dan and Mindy ship by any means. We might feel bad that things didn't work out for Mindy, but, you know, she'll meet other guys. Even if you're not rooting for Mork and Mindy, Dan isn't really a loss, especially at this point in her life. I would say on the egg scale, which measures how Mork and Mindy-ish is this episode, in the sense of I look for certain things in a Mork and Mindy episode, and did this deliver? I'm going to have to go with a 2.5. Although Robin Williams' performance as a small child is impressive, I don't know that the whole episode hangs together. There are just a lot of interesting moments. It's nice to see his revamped attic and the return of Moo Moo and face sitting and some other things that are certainly characteristic of Mork and Mindy. The episode felt a little bit off to me in various ways, partly because of that not fully processed relationship between Mork and Mindy. And so getting back to what it is on the heart scale, I think I'm going to go with a 1. In a sense, this episode is extremely platonic, and the relationship becomes much more overtly parent-child than usual. There is that undercurrent that Mork does not want Mindy to marry this other man. There is some unspoken, unrealized jealousy, that she's eating around with this man. Maybe you could argue that if Mindy married Dan, then she couldn't have Mork living with her because there's no way she could keep his secret from her husband. But I think there's also this fear that the person that Mork most loves, even though he is suspicious of emotion because of his upbringing by a computer and by a somewhat dystopian Orcan society, he loves Mindy. He worries about her leaving him. Oddly enough, his regressing to childhood turns out to be what makes her hesitate to have actual children, at least with Dan, and at least right now. Definitely an episode to watch, but I'm not quite sure where it fits into the greater course of the series. 2.5 eggs, 1 heart. This has been Paula Schaffner with episode 9, A Mommy for Morky. Thank you for listening. Nanu Nanu.
I'm putting on pearls, I'm putting on pumps, got a little lace apron on me. Gonna make you stop, gonna make you wanna watch me do the laundry. Gonna put some fun back in this ho-hum, honey. Gonna be so hot you think it ought to cost you money. You ain't gonna wanna leave.